my name is Luis, and I'm going to voice this tutorial by Guadapinos on how to create your own Easter illustration. First, we'll study the anatomy of a rabbit. We'll do this because the main focus of our illustration will be a rabbit. We just have to look for some realistic images of rabbits. These can be photos or nice drawings. We'll try to illustrate the rabbit with the use of basic geometric shapes. When you're creating an illustration, making a brief study about the basic geometric shapes or the anatomy of any animal or person will be helpful to understand what is the structure. Once you know how the anatomy of a rabbit is, you can start working on a new artboard. Here we have the references. First, create an ellipse. This will be the frame for our illustration, so everything will be inside. Begin sketching the rabbit. In this case, it will have a cartoon style, so the anatomy doesn't need to be perfect, nor it needs to have all the muscles and bones that will be present on a realistic drawing. If you need even more references, you can look for them. However, I think these ones we have here are more than enough. Once you have drawn the simplified rabbit in a front view, I say simplified because we're working in a cartoon style, draw some eggs around its feet. Try to follow the shape of the ellipse. This way, we'll achieve a look similar to a painting. These kinds of designs are good not only for illustrations, but also for stickers or tattoos. Designs that look like a cutout silhouette are great for this purpose. As you can see, I've added a long ribbon behind the rabbit as decoration. You can add as many ornaments as you want. Of course, draw the patterns on the eggs however you want. Easter eggs tend to be very decorated and colorful, so let your imagination run wild. Once you have the drawing ready, lower its opacity. Then, increase the opacity of the brush to 100% and start inking. To do that, create a new layer on top of the sketch one and use this 100% opacity brush. I suggest drawing first the general shapes and then continue with the smaller ones. For example, I'm drawing the outer shapes of the head first with thicker lines, and then I'll draw the inner shapes, which are the eyes, the nose, and the inner part of the ears. If you adjust the thickness of the lines as you go, the result will be even better. This variation in thickness usually gives depth or volume to the illustration. In the flat-colored cartoon style, in which the lines stand out even more than the colors, we need the thickness of those lines to be noticeable. As you can see here, after working some more on the illustration, you'll notice that the strokes inside the eggs are thinner. This helps us make the general shape of the eggs stand out. At the same time, because the inner shapes are thinner, they don't draw as much attention. This is important because those strokes that define the main geometric shapes, such as the head, the body, the legs, or the lips, must be thicker. Otherwise, our eyes wouldn't understand the composition properly. Try for yourself if you wish. We'll follow this same process with the ribbon we have in the upper part. Begin by drawing the outer strokes, because they're thicker than the inner ones. Then add some details carefully. I understand that objects like the ribbon behind the rabbit can be difficult to draw because it has several folds and the texture is thin. So you need to know how to draw it to achieve a somewhat realistic result. When I say realistic, I mean that the folds must look like they can be done in real life, even though we are drawing in a cartoon style. To do this, if you don't know how to achieve that depth or volume in your illustration, you can look for references. Or even better, you can take a ribbon of your own and fold it. Looking for references from real life is very important when you're drawing. It's a good way to learn and keep these concepts in our brain so that with time, we no longer need references. In this case, the ends of the ribbon will not be as realistic as they could be, but the spiral shapes work well within the composition. You can take the liberty of doing these kind of things, as long as you know what you're doing and the drawing is under your control and not the other way around. Another thing that can be great for this kind of illustrations destined for stickers or tattoos is adding external elements such as these droplets. Alright, once you've finished inking, you may proceed with the coloring. To do that, create a new ellipse and apply a color to it. Don't worry too much, you can change the color anytime. For now, it will work as a base from which we can work on the bunny. Once you have assigned a color to the ellipse, select its layer and put it below the inking one so that we can see the lines. Now color the background in a new layer below the ellipse one. As I told you before, you don't need to worry too much about the color. Later on, we can modify it until we get the most suitable one for our composition. For now, I'd suggest that you choose tones that give a nice contrast. This way, we'll tell apart the colors in a much better way than if we just had a plain white background. Once you have the background ready, create a new layer in which we'll make some kind of masks or cutouts of each part of the illustration. That is, the bunny, the eggs, and the ribbon. We'll put each one of these in different layers and we'll fill them with only one single color each. This will generate those kind of masks I was talking about before, so that later on, when we do the final coloring, we'll be able to paint only within the shapes of each part of the illustration. In Photoshop or any other digital drawing software, layers are very important, especially if we have flat colors that later on we need to modify or adjust to our liking, such as adding a texture or something like that. Now apply color to the eggs. As you can see, I modified the colors of the background and the ellipse to achieve a higher contrast. As I told you before, it's important to see contrast between the layers to have a better understanding of the colors we are applying. Remember that we can modify the colors of these pots anytime. In any case, as we're working right now on these masks, you don't need to apply that specific color to them. But it will be good for you if these colors at least resemble the ones you're thinking of using on the final coloring. That way, you could even leave those colors on the bigger shapes and then just paint the details, which will give the composition a nice look. I have already modified and adjusted the colors of the illustration, and I've been working layer by layer. If you press Ctrl U, you'll open the Hue and Saturation window, where you can modify the hue, the saturation, and the brightness of the colors. You can work more easily that way. As you can see, I've turned several layers into clipping masks. You can do that by clicking between two layers while holding Alt. The top layer will act as a clipping mask, and this way we can paint without worrying about staying inside the borders. I used mostly pink and green tones, perfect for the spring theme of the illustration. If you want to apply that global setting to several colors, you can create a new hue and saturation adjustment layer on top of them. Check the colorize box and then lower the opacity. In my case, notice that the eggs have now similar orange or brown tones. Once you have the colors, you can start applying the shadows. To paint them, use a basic Photoshop soft brush. Create a new layer and set it to multiply. Then turn it into a clipping mask and paint the shadows with a pink or a purple tone. After doing that, lower the opacity of the layer until the shadows blend perfectly into the illustration. You need to decide whether the shadows will be more or less intense by adjusting the saturation of the color or the opacity of the layer. Repeat this process with the eggs and the ribbon. As you can see, I've decided that the light source is going to be directly in front of the rabbit. The light doesn't come from the right side or the left side. This gives interest to the whole illustration without having to worry about external light sources that cast specific shadows. After all, we're only applying the basic shadows of our shapes. Now that we have the basic shadows laid out, let's go to the background and apply a circular gradient behind the rabbit. This will give more contrast between the lips and the background, and the illustration will be a bit brighter and look better. Just use a lighter color so that the background and the silhouette pop out more. Now we're going to do something nice and fun. Go to the ink layer and lock the pixels. Once you do that, you'll be able to paint only over the lines. So, choose darker and most saturated colors for each part of the illustration and paint over them. For example, for the fur, we could use a dark pink. For the eggs or even the ribbon, we could use a saturated orange. It's kind of a little trick that helps us integrate all the parts together. In fact, integrating the lines with the colors gives consistency, which will be less noticeable if we left the lines with black color. That will also give the illustration a cartoonish look, but we want it more compact, so coloring these lines is good for this purpose. You can also try to apply some highlights on the illustration. That might work or not. In my case, even though I applied some of them on the eggs, I think it was too much for the cartoon style we're going for. So I removed them and opted to keep using flat colors. This is something you should try in order to bring your illustration to the detail and volume levels that you want to achieve. Another thing that we could do to give the background more depth and richness is to create a new layer on top of the background and use a brush that has a nice texture. You can download it or create it by yourself. Choose a darker color that gives some contrast and lower the opacity of this layer. This way, you'll be able to see just a hint of the texture over the background, so it won't draw that much attention. As I said before, the background will have more richness and it won't just look like a rectangle with flat colors, which is something you see a lot in vector illustrations. The illustration would be more painterly. This might be interesting for you if you want to get an effect that emphasizes the hand-drawn look. Next, we're going to enhance the shadows a little bit. To do that, create a new layer on top of the rest and paint using a brush with a low transparency. Choose a purplish color and set the brush to multiply so that the strokes blend with the colors already present. Try to represent the shadows that the objects will cast when they're close to each other. For example, the head will cast a shadow over the neck, and the eggs will cast shadows over the ones behind them. This gives a hint of the volume and the distance between the objects. For those illustrations that have a cartoon style, it's a nice idea to emphasize this kind of shadows. Why? Because they reinforce the look. Like we did with the eggs, let's create a hue and saturation adjustment layer on top of them and choose a pinkish color. This might be helpful for you or not, so it's up to you to decide whether to leave it or not. Any hue modifications should be done according to your liking. Pay attention to the contrast to avoid having very bright parts and very dark parts. Each one must complement the others, but at the same time they must highlight specific parts. For example, the rabbit should be brighter than the background. Also, notice that we have drawn the eyes like if the rabbit were crazy, so let's redraw them normally. To do that, change the position of the pupils to give it an innocent look, and then draw a pair of soft eyebrows too. Alright, with these tricks and tips, We have our Easter Bunny illustration ready. You can use it anywhere. Posters, greeting cards. You can even send it to your friends or include it in your portfolio. I hope that you have learned a lot with this tutorial. Happy Easter and see you next time!